Unit 12, Part 2. So we have two kinds of subject-predicate sentence. When the subject is an individual referred to by a name, we have a singular sentence. Example, Dan is Australian. Categorical propositions, categorical sentences are the other type of subject-predicate sentence. Okay? Definition of a categorical sentence is a sentence where the subject and the predicate are both classes, and that asserts an inclusion or exclusion relation between the two classes. So the first thing you need to get good at is when you're presented with English sentences, ask yourself whether it's a singular sentence or a categorical sentence, right? Learn to distinguish these two kinds of linguistic being, and they are two quite different kinds of linguistic being, okay? Because think about what's going on logically. Compare two sentences, Dan is a surfer, with Australians are surfers, or which is implicitly means all Australians are surfers, okay? In both those sentences, the predicate is the same, right? Is a surfer. But in the first sentence, what's going on? Dan is a surfer. This predicate, you're applying that predicate just to that one individual, just that one guy, just Dan, right? Just that one individual. Dan is Australian. It's a singular sentence. Subject is an individual referred to by a name. But whoa, something very different is going on with Australians are surfers. You are predicating that predicate of every individual in the class, right? You're saying Australians are surfers. You're saying every Australian is a surfer, right? So the predicate isn't just applying to one singular being, but it's applying to every being that is in that class, right? That fits the description of being Australian. Okay, so it's a very different logical being. What I said there about the predicate applying to each and every one doesn't quite apply to every categorical sentence, because, as we'll see in a second, you can have a sentence like some Australians are surfers. So that's going to be a particular inclusion, right, where we're saying some of the subject class are included in the predicate class, but still we have the subject is a class, right? It's still a different kind of being than the singular sentences where you're predicating just of an individual. Okay, so first thing is, right, when you're presented with English sentences, the first skill to develop is when you're presented with English sentences, start to recognize, start to realize, or ask the question, what kind of sentence is this? Is it a singular sentence? Is it a categorical sentence? Right. Once again, not all English sentences are subject-predicate sentences, right? Simple quantified statements. Some of you will fail, right? There exists an X such that X fails. All of you will pass. For all X passes. They don't have subjects. Those are quantified sentences, sentences which tell you of how many things the propositional function is true, right? But if you have a subject-predicate sentence, right, make that distinction, or learn to distinguish the singular sentences from the categorical sentences. So as a first taste of that, this is the list of categorical sentences which Klenk uses to introduce you to the idea, page 226. Whales are mammals. Okay, think about what's going on logically with that sentence. Whales are mammals, right? Very different logical thing going on than what's going on with a singular sentence. I'm not saying Harry the gorilla is a mammal. I'm saying this entire class of being, the whales, each and every whale is a mammal, right? Whales are mammals. The predicate applies to all of the beings that fall into the class of whales, right? Predicating off this entire class. So subject is a class, right? People who watch a lot of television get brain lesions. Okay, this one's important. To get clear on the logical structure of any categorical proposition, you need to be clear in distinguishing when the subject ends and the predicate begins, right? And that is marked, the end of the subject, beginning of the predicate is marked by the verb, right? The main verb of the sentence. So it's very easy in a sentence like, Australians are surfers, right? Are, the A-R-E, form of the verb to be, right? It's like the is in Dan is Australian. The is the verb. So that marks the end of the subject in both the singular sentence and the categorical proposition. The singular sentence, Dan is Australian. Categorical, Australians are surfers. The is and the are, those are the verbs. It tells you what precedes that is the subject, what follows that is the predicate. But in a sentence like this one, people who watch a lot of television get brain lesions. You have to keep that lesson in mind to realize, right? The subject is not people. You are not speaking only of people, right? Your subject class, what is the subject class? It's the class of beings of whom you're speaking, right? And the predicate is what you are saying of your subject. But the subject here is not just people, right? It's the noun plus all the modifiers is the description of the subject. Or the noun and the modifiers counts as the subject. Quoting Klenk, we will here consider the subject expression. We will here consider the subject expression of a sentence to be the noun plus all modifiers. Right? It's the expression that specifies the thing being talked about. A couple of sentences later, the predicate of a sentence, as indicated, is what is said about the subject. Okay, so people who watch a lot of television get brain lesions. What's the verb? The verb is get, right? So when you get to the word get, what precedes that is all the subject. The subject class, right? The class of beings I'm speaking about here is people who watch a lot of television. I'm not talking about people in general. I'm certainly not predicating of all people that they get brain lesions. I'm saying if you're a person and you watch a lot of television, then you're in that class, you get a brain lesion. That's what I'm claiming with that sentence. Okay, so sometimes a bit of thinking is required to determine what exactly the subject is. This will become especially clear in Unit 13, where we do complex categorical propositions with complex subjects and predicates. And as you'll see, there's often a lot of, to get at the logical form of certain complex categoricals, there's a lot of rephrasing going on, and some of that rephrasing moves the goalpost of where the subject ends and the predicate begins. So you'll see some of that if you work through the examples in Unit 13, which is really quite a hard unit. Okay, some more examples of categorical propositions. All presidential candidates are ambitious, right? So I'm talking about a class. I'm speaking of all the presidential candidates, right? All of the men and women who fall into that class. I'm saying of each and every one of them that he or she is ambitious, right? So again, subject is a class. Right. There are people who don't like television. My subject is people, right? That one is actually, there are people who don't like television. It's going to be particular exclusion. Let me put this stuff up before I explain that. Okay, last example is people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Okay, so as you'll see, Klenk has these, the subject class italicized, right? So I'm up to this one. So it's people who live in glass houses should not throw stones, right? Should, that's the verb.